Thank you so much, everyone. And if you can, please ignore my my notes. Thank you to Queer Disrupt for such an incredible conference, some really moving and thought-provoking presentations, and it's really an honor to present alongside all of you, not just the panel as well today that I've got the pleasure of speaking with. My name's Claire. I don't know how to work technology, but I'm happy to be a PhD student at the Bartlett School of Architecture at UCL, where I've been researching queer practices of placemaking through the experiences, memories and histories of LGBTQ activists in London. And today I'm really going to be sharing two ideas I've been exploring within my research. So the first is on queer asterisms as activist spatial practices. Asterisms are informal groupings of stars, and while I am the furthest thing from an astronomist, thinking through stars helps me make sense of the fragmentary, fleeting, personal and overlapping experiences of being queer in London, and how we visualize, remember and connect to particular moments and memories across different places. The second idea is collaging as a queer approach to mapping. Collaging is about fragments, misalignment, layers, removed from their original context to create new connections. And I think because of this, collaging is really a perfect medium to represent these ephemeral and overlapping experiences. Before I go in any further on these ideas, I just wanted to touch briefly on my interpretation of queer and of queer placemaking. So the term queer is weighted with history, but it's also light with future potential. Once slur, it now refers to sexual and gender identities that are not straight, as well as questions the stability of these very categories. So shifting spatially, socially, and temporally, queer is noun and verb, action and identity, to queer and to be queer. Queerness can be embodied, as well as seep beyond boundaries imposed by skin to become horizon. This, of course, echoes José Esteban Munoz, who's been mentioned several times throughout the conference, who positioned queerness as a horizon imbued with potentiality, and where I also build my own understanding of queerness. So understanding how places gain meaning is a rooted part of my research, and how activists do so through their embodied personal experiences of intervening in places. These interventions are the queer practices of placemaking, from protests and marches, direct action to pay steps, to organizing meetings and trainings, traveling to and away from these, and from the love and loss along the way. It's as much as the out and proud as it is the quieter forms of activism, not always so out and not always so proud. But activism, like queerness, is facing a horizon which is not yet here. I believe that linking the complexity and unfixity of the word queer to placemaking allows for an exciting potential. And while I originally came to placemaking through urban planning, I trained as an urban planner, I found myself more and more engaging with queer theory. And this work instead positions some of the ways queer activists experience and remember spaces in London. I would be remiss, of course, to not include here at a conference which included a keynote with Jack Halberstam's own positioning of placemaking as practices in which queer people engage in and create new understandings of space. Carried in the memories and bodies of activists, queer placemaking provides a nuanced understanding of how spaces are experienced and produced by queer lives. And it tries to capture the multiple tensions space can hold for queer people, of belonging and unbelonging, of being included and excluded, of trauma, shame and grief, but also joy, pride and resilience. And to speak of asterisms, I have to first speak about constellations. Rather than go to lengths at setting out this theory, I would suggest picking up Diane Chisholm's Queer Constellations and Jean-Jacques Giesking's A Queer New York for further reading. And I can drop these in the chat afterwards. Or you could also just read them off my notes. As some context though, Jean-Jacques defines constellations as historical acts and promises of radical futures, which reveals queer places as scattered and visible only when you know where and when to look, in ways similar to stars and other celestial objects. So for queers, relying on places to make sense of our identity, community, and relationships produces a landscape of fragmentary and fleeting constellations carried in and on people's memories and bodies. So as part of my methodology, I conducted a series of one-on-one walking interviews where participants were asked to create a map from memory, exploring how their activism connects to the physical spaces of London. These individual maps are what you can see here on the slides, and which I'm just going to flick through as I speak. Originally drawn by the participants, I began using tracing paper to experiment and play with layering and transparency. You'll have seen as my opening slide an image which is actually of all of the tracings stacked on top of each other, playing with depth and transparency. But tracing these has really allowed me to press into the grain of the maps, to follow the lines, and to step into the interviews in a different way. So each map represents an interview with one activist cutting across histories of London in different areas from the 1970s to early 2020. These were used to guide our interview, referring to things they had plotted as we walked along. So these maps are both distinct and overlapping, with landmarks warping in size and roads not actually existing. Ironically, most of my interviews, we would get lost at least once, but these hand-drawn maps helped cluster onto paper the memories of activism communities and histories of each participant. But as my understanding of constellations has deepened in its spatial sense, I found myself going back to its etymology, a group of fixed stars to which a definite name has been given, but does not form part of another group. I began tripping up against the words fixed, indefinite, and the inference of a lack of overlap. Constellations began to sit uncomfortably against my own understandings of queerness. In fact, while constellations may point to the fragmentary and fleeting, they also speak to boundaries and borders. Traditional constellations are star patterns with a well-established name, recognized by the International Astronomical Union, which determines a constellation as an exactly defined sector of the cosmic space that belongs to a particular traditional constellation. This union acts as an internationally recognized authority for assigning constellations. On its request in the 1930s, a Belgian astronomer, and I'm going to paraphrase a quote, parceled out plots of the celestial sphere and allocated permanent fields of different shapes and surfaces with celestial objects belonging to certain constellations, meaning that they were positioned within the boundaries of defined fields. Parceling out plots, permanence, allocated fields within boundaries, the use of words such as well-established and traditional feel like really uncomfortable oxymorons to use in relation to queer constellations, to position them as fragmentary and fleeting and yet fixed, defined, and definite. While thinking about through constellations as spatial practices puts queer experiences in closer dialogue with placemaking, this description of constellations begins to sound closer to a tactic of dividing and conquering than the reading of placemaking I want to explore. While this is not a study of astronomy, if we are to use words like constellations, then we must think about their consequence and interrogate their limits. So I began reaching for other words, which is when I came across asterism. Asterism finds its roots in 1590s Greek, aster, star, and asterismos, a marking with stars. Until the 20th century, asterism was used interchangeably with constellation, until the former completely disappeared, and today they have come to mean everything that is not a constellation. But how can what was once like now be anything but a constellation? While constellation has become increasingly used and popularized, asterism has become somewhat obsolete, occupying an overlooked no man's land of everything that is not, lacking any uniform definition or classification. This presents an opportunity to propose a term which positions the patterns of stars outside of the official framing of borders and boundaries. So this distinction that I'm going to quite some lengths to set up between constellation and asterisms is useful because it provides nuances to queer placemaking, which I'd like to highlight somewhat briefly. Firstly, asterisms are patterns formed by groups of stars, both within a single constellation or across different constellations. They do not have officially determined boundaries, whereas constellations comparatively come with borders demarcating regions in the sky. Secondly, asterisms in their informal grouping can be recognizable to many, but they're also deeply personal. And this really highlights the subjective nature of queer placemaking. Their informal, borderless nature speaks to queerness in a way that constellations does not, bordered and fixed. Asterisms then feels more appropriate when speaking about the fluid, fragmentary, overlapping experiences of activists. Queer asterisms provide a different way of thinking through queer spatial histories and is more aligned with how I understand queer placemaking, as a way for queer identifying people to make sense of their place in the world, carried in their personal subjective experiences of moving, remembering, and existing within it, in ways which are fragmentary, fleeting, scattered, and deeply personal. So something I've wanted to play with is how to present queer memories and places in a queer or queered way. And mapping's really been a central theme in my research, from the hand-drawn maps to GPS recordings of our actual walks. But of course, mapping, cartography come with an inherited history entrenched in power and politics. So it's profoundly important to interrogate its use, especially when it comes to documenting the lives and histories of minority groups, including LGBTQ communities. However, I wanted to explore ways of dislocating histories from fixed locations, and so began to play with alternative forms of representing this. In thinking through the overlapping histories, memories, and places as asterisms, this opened up creative possibilities, which has led me to collaging. So what I'm sharing with you today are 3 collages which actually exist alongside some of my chapters, and they each speak to a particular theme that emerged during the research. I'm aware that it probably looks really teeny tiny at this point, but I hope you're getting a little bit of the sense of what these look like. I'm just going to speak about their content super briefly and then just touch back on the process before finishing. But the collages are made from the hand-drawn maps, which sit on top of images connected to the different memories, history, spaces, which are referenced throughout the interviews, or through some of the interviews. So this first collage is based on some of the different groups and actions that were mentioned, and kind of explores how LGBTQ activism intersects with physical spaces, as well as how they echo these different histories. So the sites that are visualized relate to the repeating histories of protests mentioned during these interviews. So for example, Trafalgar Square was mentioned by quite a few participants, and particularly the protests of the Gay Liberation Front, returning to its base with its famous lines, 50 years since one of its first protests in 1979, and then again in 2019. Another example is at the top, where I have deconstructed a photo of several groups such as Lesbian and Gay Support the Migrants and Sexual Avengers, who with other groups took to Vauxhall Bridge to drop a banner which said "Queer Solidarity Smashes Borders" in protest of Trump's election in 2017, I believe. The second collage is based on a single interview with Leonie, a lesbian who started her activism in the 1980s. This collage particularly picks up on the role of alternative independent press and newsletters, such as Spare Rib and Shocking Pink, and bookshops which acted as both spaces for accessing publications as well as organizing. So Gaze the Word, Sister Right and Silver Moon, and how they connected to lesbian feminist activism which emerged from them and the places in which they occurred. So, for example, the long-standing and ongoing lesbian discussion group at Gaze the Word was established in 1981, was an important place for Leonie as it's where she met a lot of her friends, and it's also how she got involved with meetings for lesbian and gay support the minors and lesbians against pit closures. Alternative independent press and newsletters act as important stars for Leonie, particularly as a volunteer at Spare Rib, which was a second wave feminist magazine in the UK that emerged in the late 1960s. And Spare Rib really allowed her to connect to different actions and movements, notably lesbian strength marches and Green and Common Women's Peace Camp. The final collage looks at how activism and public spaces connect to traumatic memories. In particular, it touches on the inheritance of sites of hate crime as places of collective history and the subversion of sites of hate crime as places of personal history, and how these become part of the built environment in some way. So an example here of collective history is the 1999 bombing of the Admiral Duncan on Old Compton Street that killed 3, which was something that emerged several times again during the interviews. And for which the activist collective, the Sexual Avengers, placed their version of a blue plaque commemorating this history, which you can see just at the center. And then the final example of personal history are the pansies, which are across the middle of the page. And this was from an interview I did with Paul, who runs the Pansy Project, who plants pansies at sites of homophobic and transphobic abuse as an act of quiet resistance. Okay, so the idea to collaborate chapters with a type of visual was really inspired by Rebecca Solnit and her trilogy of atlases of San Francisco, New York, and New Orleans. And Solnit, with artists, writers, and cartographers, pairs essays with maps, building on traditional map making to really emphasize the imaginative, the communal, and storytelling. And I love that. All 3 of these maps are not in any final stage. They're actually kind of iterative, meaning that I'm going to keep making versions of these until I submit. And also because I keep engaging with my research in different ways, depending on where I'm at within my PhD. So collaging itself is a subversive tool, liberating imagery and text from their familiar or logical contexts. Queering and collaging share similarities in that for both, things are taken from their context and reassembled into new ways. It's about fragments and misalignment and layering, becoming somewhat illegible. Collaging ultimately is a powerful way of expressing perspectives and experiences of being in the world, which intervenes in the heterosexist visual culture and constructs new worlds. And in this way, I really believe that collaging makes visible alternative spaces. And I think this really speaks to asterisms. By being fragmentary, misaligned, dislocated, reorganized, collages are a valuable contribution to queer approaches to mapping. They are an alternative to representing queer experiences without situating these histories within traditional cartographic methods, and instead really highlight the ephemeral, overlapping, and partial experiences of activists. And I'm, of course, hugely inspired by Jack's talk yesterday on the aesthetics of collapse, and I'd like to think through some of those ideas a bit more. And I also just want to say that I really want to position collaging as a valuable way of representing data in non-textual ways. And this is because it has been shown to enhance a researcher's understanding and analysis of their work, and is a different way of representing the stories of those interviews. I'm going to skip a little because I'm conscious of time, but it's in this process of moving back and forth between the interviews, the participant maps, the theory, the archive, the desk, the motions of tracing, cutting, gluing, that collaging really becomes another iterative way of connecting with the research. To close, I just wanted to make a quick note. You'll have noticed that I keep saying queer placemaking rather than a queer practice of placemaking, which I reference in my title. And in truth, this is because 18 or 21 minutes is not that long, and I keep tripping up on repeating the entire thing. But I'd like to close on a quick note on its phrasing, as it does feel really important. And I'm really less interested in reaching a conclusion, which is something that I've heard again and again through the conference, than I am about creating and holding a space for all that is inconclusive and for that to still have validity. So in a queer practice of placemaking, the A signifies a resistance to definition, and that this research constitutes only one effort to develop an understanding of it. One which is from my own particular queer bodily dwelling and the experiences, privileges, and oppressions I might embody. Yours may be different. The A instead allows for a plurality of future understandings. Placemaking rather than place made denotes action, a continual doing, a resistance to fixity, with a queer practice, in the words of Munoz, being how we are in the world as well as inventing the world. A queer practice of placemaking, then, is the many acts of doing and undoing, of places being made and unmade. And I'm going to stop there for time. Thank you.